You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.
Adams had been quite meticulous in putting out his feelers. He had this incredible web of informants across the European continent. And what they were reporting back to him is that France had expected that it could really bully the United States, that it was much more divided internally and would be a pushover for anything that France had asked for. And when instead the United States responded with strength, with outrage, with these defensive measures, France had really done a 180. They actually didn't want war, and Adams was very much right about that assumption.
Hello, and welcome to episode 403 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. Did you know that John Adams, not George Washington, solidified the precedents of the executive branch and the presidency of the United States? Lindsay Chervinsky, an award-winning presidential historian and the executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library, has just written a book about this very topic. It's called Making the Presidency: John Adams and the Precedents that Forged the Republic. Lindsay joins us today so that we can investigate the presidency of the United States' second president, John Adams. Now, during our investigation, Lindsay reveals precedents that George Washington set for the presidency that John Adams helped solidify for the future. The political and international crises that John Adams inherited, including tensions with Great Britain and France, and a very vicious discord between the Federalist and Democratic Republican parties. And how John Adams navigated these crises to secure peace with France and the peaceful transition of power between political parties in the United States. But first, if you haven't already, please come join us in the Ben Franklin's World listener community on Facebook. The community is a fun place to check in about history-related news, and it's also a place where other listeners share questions about history, details about the books that they're reading or the historic sites that they're visiting, and there are often pictures of those historic sites. And we even have people researching their genealogy because many of them are researching where their families come from and the worlds that they lived in. So if you enjoy talking about history, doing some research, please come join us. The community is free to join. Visit benfranklinsworld.com/Facebook. That's benfranklinsworld.com/Facebook. Okay, are you ready to investigate the presidency of John Adams? Let's go meet our guest historian. Joining us is a presidential historian and the executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library. She's an award-winning historian who regularly writes for publications like The Wall Street Journal, Ms. Magazine, The Daily Beast, Time, and The Washington Post. You may remember our guest from episode 279, when we discussed her first book, The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution. Today, she joins us to discuss a sequel to that book, Making the Presidency: John Adams and the Precedents that Forged the Republic. Welcome back to Ben Franklin's World, Lindsay Chervinsky.
Thank you so much for having me back.
So, Lindsay, when we left our last conversation in episode 279, George Washington had successfully created the cabinet, and he set a lot of precedents for executive power and how the cabinet and the executive department as a whole should work together. And in your new book, Making the Presidency, you discuss how it was really up to John Adams, not George Washington, to solidify Washington's precedents in the executive branch. So would you tell us about the work that lay ahead of John Adams as he became the second president of the United States in March 1797? What precedents did John Adams have to set for the presidency and the executive branch so that it could actually work together?
Absolutely. Thank you so much again for having me. I'm really excited to talk about John Adams. I think that he is a very much an underappreciated figure in maybe not in the Revolutionary period, but certainly in the early Republic period. And that's largely because when we talk about precedents, when we talk about the norms and customs that continue to really shape the presidency today, they require repetition in order to actually become a thing. So Washington established, I think, a quite productive and effective model for what the presidency could be. But those models only take on power if someone decides to repeat them and start to teach the people both around him and also American citizens to respect them and to expect that they will be upheld. And that is something in a republic where most of our systems and our customs are not enforced by military might. Takes a long time to start to establish that sort of foundational piece of what it means to be a republic. So much of the presidency is really based on this. And so, for example, John Adams, some of the big questions that were facing him when he came into office were, would the presidency actually work for someone else? Because it had enormous discretion, enormous authority, and people weren't sure they could trust somebody else with it. They weren't sure that other institutions or the other branches of government would work with the presidency if someone else was in that office, or even how foreign nations might respond to the United States with someone else at the helm.
Yeah, it did seem like one of the big things that John Adams had to figure out was, how does he run the executive branch without Washington's oversized personality, a personality that people both respected and were afraid of?
That's exactly right. So much of Washington's power and so many of the decisions he made were unchecked or unquestioned because he was the one making them. Now, often I think they were actually the right decision. He was quite deliberative and careful about his decision-making process and included a lot of people in the advisory piece of that. But he very rarely received pushback because of who he was. That was not going to be the case with John Adams, both because the political culture and the system had shifted significantly. The first early political parties were really coming into their own, but also just because he didn't enjoy that unparalleled stature among the American people or even in his own party.
Now, when we read your book, Making the Presidency, it seems like George Washington was rather excited to retire and to hand everything off to the next guy. But it meant that John Adams came to be second president during a time that not only had domestic turmoil, but a lot of international turmoil, which was part of the reason why George Washington was so excited to retire. So would you tell us what was going on within the United States in terms of its politics, and what was happening in the Atlantic world that John Adams has to navigate during his presidency?
That's exactly right. Washington was actually quite excited to leave the presidency. He had been in public service for a very long time. He hadn't even wanted to run for the second term. He'd kind of gotten bullied into it by a lot of people around him. And he left at a time that he felt that he had sort of established enough of the foundation for the presidency that he could hand it to someone else. But also, the nation had existed for long enough that some of the early problems were beginning to emerge. This is fairly similar to if you build a house and it's new construction. After about 15 to 20 years, your appliances start to fail. Maybe you need to have your roof checked. This is true with the nation. And that was true both domestically and internationally. In particular, the relationship with France and Great Britain was quite fraught because the United States had signed a new treaty with Great Britain called the Jay Treaty towards the end of Washington's presidency. It helped resolve some of the lingering tensions from the Revolutionary War, though not all. But it made France really angry because it felt like it undermined their, quote, most favorite nation status in terms of the alliance between France and the United States. And so they started to seize American ships, imprison American sailors, and sell off the goods and keep the profit for themselves, which obviously was quite unpopular with Americans. They wanted their ships and their family members and their stuff back. So both of these nations were really sort of pressing on the United States and were challenging it as an independent nation. Domestically, there were a lot of tensions that I think will sound similar today. There were a series of rolling pandemics, increased immigration, questions about citizenship and who belonged, questions about free speech and the potential for sedition, political violence. There were contested elections, foreign interference in elections. These were just some of the things that Adams was facing.
We are going to tackle those international and domestic quagmires, those problems that Adams has to deal with throughout his presidency. But before we dive into those topics, let's talk about the cabinet. Lindsay, in your first book, The Cabinet, you talk about how important the cabinet was as both an advisory body to the president and as the workhorse of the executive branch. You also discuss how it was the work of the cabinet secretaries to keep the departments of government functioning, which is why George Washington took great care in constructing his cabinet, finding the right people and putting them into these jobs so that they could build a new nation together. Would you remind us about the work that the cabinet does, the precedents that Washington set for the cabinet, and then how John Adams went about establishing his own cabinet, because it seems like Adams's decision about how he went about establishing his cabinet is something that he's going to have to contend with for the rest of his presidency.
So the Constitution mentions department secretaries, but it doesn't say anything else. And it left it up to Congress to figure out how many there would be, what types of departments, and any other particular regulations or rules. And the first federal Congress in the summer of 1789 created 3 departments: State, War, and Treasury, and a position of Attorney General, which really served as a constitutional advisor. So there was an expectation from the very beginning that these individuals would manage those departments, and most of the responsibilities of the federal government fell under those departments. So things like the consuls that were stationed around the globe that would help Americans if they got into trouble, those reported back to the State Department. The tax officials that were stationed at different ports, especially on the Atlantic seaboard, those all reported back to the Treasury Department. So they had very important managerial responsibilities. They also, in the Constitution, it said that they can provide written advice to the president. And so there was an understanding that these individuals would also play some sort of advisory body when big questions came up that the president needed support on. And Washington's innovation was recognizing that written advice, it's inefficient today, but imagine how inefficient it is when you're talking about parchment and quill. So he realized that that was really not going to work, but also that a lot of the really tricky problems that he was facing and his successors were facing required the input of multiple people because they didn't have easy answers. And so you needed a lot of different perspectives, and they often touched on the work of a lot of different departments. And so 2.5 years into his administration, on November 26, 1791, he convened his first cabinet meeting where he brought all of his secretaries together. And he did so roughly 91 times over the course of the rest of his presidency. Usually it was either when there was a precedent-setting issue, a question about the Constitution, or an international crisis or a domestic crisis. And he established a couple of really important precedents for his successors. First, the cabinet is designed to work as the president wants it. So there are no external regulations that determine how regularly the cabinet has to meet, or whether or not the president even needs to take their advice. So sometimes Washington met with the cabinet all the time. Sometimes he met with them once every 6 months, just depended on what he wanted. Second, that the cabinet secretaries didn't have an institutional right to be a part of the decision-making process. So they could give their advice, they could ask to be in the room, but they couldn't demand it. That precedent in particular actually turned out to be much more flexible, or perhaps needed additional backing up by the people that followed, because Washington's assertion of his decision-making was unchecked by his cabinet secretaries, and that was not necessarily true for those that followed. So John Adams, when he came into office, he had every expectation that he would have a cabinet because Washington had created it, but there was no model of the secretaries giving their resignation, sort of a pro forma resignation at the end of the administration. There was no other type of cabinet that he could look to as an example. And so he decided to keep Washington secretaries, thinking that if there had been a problem, Washington would have gotten rid of them. He had no reason not to trust them. And he knew how hard it had been for Washington to find replacements when people left office. And he figured, well, if Washington had trouble, then he would as well.
You also noted in Making the Presidency that part of the trouble Washington had filling his second cabinet was that cabinet positions were not well-paid positions. Plus, secretaries had to live in Philadelphia or the nation's capital, and people just didn't want to leave their families for months on end.
That's right. They really didn't have the prestige that we associate with cabinet positions today, and they were very onerous. It's very hard work. And as you said, the travel was really hard. And so it was difficult to go back and forth, and often uncomfortable and sometimes even unsafe. People typically accepted the position either if they were very close to the president and had a personal loyalty, if they already lived in Philadelphia, or if they desperately needed the money. Otherwise, they typically said no.
Another thing I found very curious when I read your book, Making the Presidency, is that George Washington spent a lot of time and was thoughtful about the precedents he set, but he didn't take any time to clue John Adams into what these precedents were, how they worked, and he never invited John Adams to a cabinet meeting, even as he was the vice president. So John Adams never saw the cabinet at work, and he never saw George Washington and his cabinet secretaries interact and assist each other. So he didn't have any frame of mind for how the cabinet was supposed to work. And I found this really curious because George Washington knew that John Adams was going to be his successor. He spent a lot of time thinking about his legacy, and yet Washington still didn't invite John Adams for a chat about how everything worked and about the position he'd be inheriting.
That's right. This is an area where I think Washington could have done better. Sometimes he made really exquisite leadership decisions, and other times I think he fell a little short, just like everyone does. And this is one of those spots. It's hard to know exactly why, because he didn't tell us his thinking, but I think it's some combination of three factors. One, as we talked about, he was tired and he wanted to go home. So sort of anything that delayed that process, he was not going to be pleased about. The second factor was that he perhaps felt that he needed to be a little bit more reserved and aloof because it would be inappropriate for him to interfere or to tell Adams how to do his job, sort of what we might think of as like a small R Republican reserve. And I think that is fitting with his personality. He often didn't tell other people how to be leaders. So that makes sense to me. I think the third factor is he didn't really trust John Adams' political judgment, and they weren't very close. So instead, he asked his current cabinet secretaries to stay on as a way to ensure that his policies were preserved and continued without really having to talk to Adams, which is a shame because I think if they had had more conversations, they would have realized actually how aligned they were on most issues. And it would have been extraordinarily helpful for Adams to have a better understanding about how this office worked.
So John Adams made the decision to keep George Washington's second cabinet because it would have been hard for him to fill the positions. George Washington had a hard time filling these positions. Plus, George Washington picked these men, so the logic must carry that they were qualified men. What kind of relationship was John Adams able to establish with these men? These were George Washington's men. Were they going to be loyal to Adams? Was Adams going to be able to ask for the advice that George Washington had asked them for? What were the dynamics that Adams was walking into by keeping George Washington's cabinet in place?
Well, initially, I think he thought that the relationship was fine. He believed that they were men of honor and that they would be loyal to the office of the presidency. I think that is also our expectation generally today, and I think that expectation holds more true in the 21st century when we've had centuries of building up the prestige of the office of the presidency. At the time, it didn't exist in the same way, and so most of the secretaries were actually loyal to Alexander Hamilton first, George Washington second, and then John Adams far down on the list. Initially, that relationship was perfectly cordial, and Adams did get advice from them. Oftentimes, he was getting advice from them that they had gotten from Alexander Hamilton, and sometimes that worked when Hamilton and Adams were actually on the same page without knowing it. But that relationship quickly began to sour when they had differing opinions, and the secretaries believed that they were smarter and they knew better and tried to assert their will over the president.
So there is this intermeddler unknown to Adams and his cabinet. Let's see how this dynamic played out during Adams's presidency. John Adams entered office believing that the best course of action for the new United States was to follow George Washington's policy of neutrality towards both Great Britain and France in 1797. Lindsay, could we talk about why John Adams felt that this was an important priority issue? Why was the threat of war with France such a big issue for the new United States? Why was war something to be avoided?
It's really important that we don't confuse our position as the United States now with our position of the United States in the 18th century, because we were just a tiny little baby nation at that point. We didn't create a naval department until 1798, and the army, when Adams came into office, was about 2,500 men. So our ability to fight a war against France, even if France was very distracted and had a lot of other things going on, was always going to be in question. And at this point, this is the age of Napoleon. So you just don't know how war is going to go when Napoleon is involved. So Adams, from the very beginning, recognized that war is always unpredictable and always fatal to someone or to something. But it also wasn't in America's best economic interest because the United States did a very brisk trade, especially between New England and the Caribbean, selling food, selling other sorts of supplies that the French colonies needed in order to survive. So it was much better for that relationship to be a peaceful one. And he was eager to preserve U.S. trade, eager to preserve America's ability to participate in the global community. This should not be confused with an isolationist perspective, because that was not what he was saying at all. But it was really important for him to try and find that middle ground. And a lot of people supported that position, including a lot of Democratic Republicans. But a lot of arch Federalists disagreed with it because war footing had been very good for their party politically. And the new expanded U.S. Army, Congress had expanded that to about 50,000 people, was basically a spoil system for the Federalist Party. And so they were loath to give up those types of opportunities.
And we should remind ourselves that John Adams is actually a very skilled diplomat, that he wasn't just making these decisions of neutrality to follow in Washington's footsteps, but that he actually had a lot of experience in foreign policy by 1797.
He was probably the most experienced diplomat that the United States had at the time that he came into the office of the presidency. He had served in France twice. He had served in London, and he had served at The Hague. And in doing so, he had had a lot of different types of experiences, signing trade negotiations, getting loans from the Dutch for our Revolutionary War effort, signing post-war agreements with places like the United Kingdom. And that experience gave him a very good understanding of how European nations worked and what their motivations were. And this was something that a lot of other Americans missed, which was that European nations did not give a fig about what happened to the United States unless it affected their bottom dollar. All they cared about were their interests and their own national concerns, as frankly, probably rightly so, all nations do that. But a lot of Americans thought that Europeans cared a lot more about the United States than they did. And so that very rational, very realistic perspective was hard earned by John Adams and was very important for his time in office.
Once John Adams chose diplomacy with France as the path for the United States, he dispatched a peace delegation. Would you tell us about this delegation and why Adams sent a delegation and not just a single ambassador, and how their peace negotiation went with France?
So Adams sent a 3-person commission fairly early on in his presidency to France to try and negotiate a new arrangement to resolve a lot of these tensions. And he had selected the commission quite carefully to ensure that there were members from multiple different states and multiple different perspectives. The problem was twofold. One, those delegates arrived in France and they were met with a series of unofficial representatives, which John Marshall, in his descriptions of these conversations, called Agent X, Agent Y, and Agent Z. And the Americans made the mistake of starting conversations with these unofficial representatives before they were ever recognized as American ministers in France. So even if they had gotten concessions, it wouldn't have been an official agreement because these people didn't actually have an official position with the French government. The second was the reality of what it meant to do diplomacy in the 18th century. At best, it took about 4 weeks to get from Philadelphia to the coast of France. So at best, it's going to take 2 months for a letter to go from Philadelphia, arrive in France, have them respond, and then have it come back. In reality, if the weather was poor, if one of the ships miscarried, it could take up to 6 months to hear from someone across the globe. And so if something came up, if new conditions emerged in France, if they had follow-up questions, they couldn't act quickly because they couldn't get information quickly. So Adams had to really trust that when he sent people across the globe, they would follow his instructions. But he couldn't be sure of it. And it caused, I think, a great deal of anxiety, waiting, trying to find out what had happened.
Plus, these unofficial delegates also requested bribes from Adams's delegation, which also seemed to throw a big monkey wrench into his plans for diplomacy.
Yes. So these unofficial representatives actually asked for a couple of things. They wanted bribes for themselves first. They wanted loans from the United States that they could use in their war against Great Britain. And they wanted a series of embarrassing apologies about speeches that the president had made, which for the purpose of sort of national honor was not going to happen. So the American ministers, who were John Marshall, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, and Elbridge Gerry, kind of disagreed over how to interpret these requests, but they all agreed that bribes could not happen and they were not going to make the apologies. Eventually, they were there for over 6 months, and they met with the French representatives regularly. And eventually, they were forced from the country because they would not concede to these conditions. And then when reports of that treatment came back to the United States, it became known as the XYZ affair for those 3 agents. And Americans were outraged because they felt like the treatment was very much an insult to national honor and to their national sovereignty, and was not quite an act of war, but was pretty close.
How did John Adams respond to these reports? And then the official news when the delegates came home to say, yes, this is exactly what happened. We were asked for bribes, and there really doesn't seem to be a chance for peace right now.
When he first got the reports, he kind of was like scribbling in the margins, calling out the areas where they had made rookie mistakes. And I think he would have handled things quite differently. And so there was initially some frustration there. But there was a recognition that at that point, diplomacy was not necessarily possible. Although, interestingly, the envoys, once they returned, they did say that while peace didn't seem possible, that France didn't seem to necessarily want war either, which was a very important distinction. Adams responded by encouraging Congress to pass a series of defensive measures, so not declaring war, but doing things like boosting coastal defenses, expanding the Navy. He did not want the huge army that Congress ended up creating, but as a good New Englander, he understood the importance of the Navy, both for national defense, but also for protecting U.S. trade. So he felt like that would be a very good investment.
So the peace commissioners come home. The United States starts to prepare for war by increasing its army and navy. And John Adams recognized that he really needs to figure out a solution for this diplomatic impasse because he still really wants to chart a course for neutrality. But meanwhile, the American people are enraged about how the French treated the American peace delegation. How did Adams's cabinet secretaries react to this failed peace negotiation?
They were a little bit split. Some initially wanted to take cautious action, do the same sort of defensive measures, but it took a while for the envoys to make their way out of France and to make their way back to the United States. And some members in the cabinet were quite concerned that if the U.S. declared war right away, then the envoys would be captured or imprisoned or assassinated. And so they wanted to kind of wait to see what happened with their fellow Americans. Others, like Secretary of State Timothy Pickering, was immediately gung-ho for war and tried to whip votes in Congress for a war declaration.
Yeah. Would you tell us more about Timothy Pickering? Because he seems to be a leader of this group called the Arch Federalists. And Pickering also seems to be the person on Adams's cabinet who keeps Alexander Hamilton very informed of the inner workings of the Adams administration. And then, of course, filters Alexander Hamilton's orders and insights back to Adams without Adams knowing that these orders and insights are coming from Alexander Hamilton, who John Adams really despised.
Timothy Pickering was probably one of the all-time worst secretaries of state. He was often quite difficult, sometimes insubordinate, sometimes outright defying the president's orders. He believed himself to be the smartest person in the room all the time, despite sometimes sharing a room with some of the greatest minds in American history. He believed that anyone who disagreed with him was an enemy to be crushed, and he believed that compromise was a moral failing. So these are not generally personality traits you want in the position that is most in charge of diplomacy and compromise with foreign nations. In particular, when it came to France, he loathed France, and he thought war would be great, and he really liked the army. He was very loyal to Hamilton, so he was funneling all of the secret cabinet information to Hamilton without Adams' permission or approval, and then was taking what Hamilton was saying and presenting it as his own opinions. This is really where Pickering and Adams started to split, was over how to respond to this threat from France and going forward, how best to handle the international relationship.
What about this standing army we keep talking about? You mentioned that Congress voted to create a standing army after it learned about the XYZ affair. And we know that John Adams hedged his bets about war with France. And even though he preferred to find a diplomatic solution, he still understood that the United States had a real need to be prepared for war just in case peace with France didn't work out. So what should we know about this standing army, and where did it fit with Adams's plans against a possible war with France?
So I think there were 2 reasons that Adams felt like war was not necessarily the best recourse or even the most likely outcome. One, he understood how much France depended on American trade for its colonial support. He understood that France was in a war with Great Britain, and if the United States joined in the war, it would then ally with Britain, and that was not an outcome that France wanted. And so he was sort of thinking in a realpolitik fashion about what France would do. The second piece was the standing army. So he had not asked for a big army when he was asking for defensive measures. Congress had sort of created this on its own initiative. And the question in particular was what the officer corps and the governing structure of the army would look like. To sort of stave off Hamilton, Adams asked Washington to come back and take command of the forces. And Washington agreed as long as he could stay at home at Mount Vernon until France invaded, which meant that whoever was number two was going to actually have most of the day-to-day governing authority. Pickering and the other cabinet secretaries all wanted that to be Alexander Hamilton. And John Adams wanted anyone else. He really didn't trust Hamilton, and I think for good reason. I mean, Hamilton was incredibly talented, incredibly gifted, and did have the capacity to manage the type of details that the position required. But he also wanted to use the army to march south through Virginia, crush domestic opposition, and then go to South America and start some rebellions. So he was not a particularly trustworthy person when it came to a giant armed force. Basically, the cabinet maneuvered over the summer of 1798 and kind of convinced Washington to threaten to resign unless he got his way. And his way was to have Hamilton as the number two. I blame Washington a little bit for this, but I also think a lot of it was the maneuvering in terms of no one was having face-to-face conversations. And so it allowed for a lot of behind-the-scenes machinations and conniving among these various forces. Adams at that point had to give in because if Washington quit on him, it would kneecap his presidency and would be incredibly unpopular. But it meant that he really distrusted the army because he understood that it was a very political force. It was not going to be loyal to him. It was going to be loyal to the Federalist Party first. And so he started to find ways both to slow the development of the army while increasing the development of the Navy and also pursuing diplomacy to negate the need for that big of an army.
Did John Adams know at this point in 1798 that many of his cabinet secretaries were working for another boss in Alexander Hamilton and passing messages between them? Actually, wait, before you answer that, let's take a moment to thank our episode sponsor. There is always a lot going on at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. With so much to see, do, and experience in Colonial Williamsburg, like special events, new programming, new museum exhibits, archaeology digs, and building restorations, your best way to get to know the foundation and stay on top of its happenings is to join its mailing lists, which you can do at benfranklinsworld.com/CW subscribe. At benfranklinsworld.com/CW subscribe, you can sign up for one or more of Colonial Williamsburg's mailing lists. There are mailing lists for seasonal updates, events, and special offers, the art museums of Colonial Williamsburg, the Colonial Williamsburg Teacher Institute, The Power of Place, which is a list all about how you can support the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation and its work. And there's even a mailing list for shopping and special deals in Colonial Williamsburg shops. Once you sign up for one or more of Colonial Williamsburg's mailing lists, the foundation will send you insider information about your favorite parts of Colonial Williamsburg. To sign up for a mailing list, visit benfranklinsworld.com/CW subscribe. That's benfranklinsworld.com/CW subscribe. Lindsay, did John Adams know that his cabinet secretaries were working for another boss in Alexander Hamilton?
It's a good question. I think he started to suspect some things in the summer of 1798 into 1799. He didn't necessarily always have proof, but he occasionally would say statements to McHenry like, I think this is how this is happening. And usually his hypothesis was spot on. Why he took so long to do something about it is also an excellent question. I think partly it was he was trying not to split the party while there was still a threat of war lingering. He also understood that doing so would harm any potential re-election chances he hoped to have. So I think it was both trying to hold on as long as possible for the good of the nation, but also perhaps politically motivated.
But what was Adams's interest in keeping the Federalist Party together? What did he and the other Federalists think would happen if the Federalist Party collapsed and lost their re-election?
I think there were two concerns. One, if you do end up having a war, you don't want to have a lot of intra-party fighting while a war is taking place. You want the nation to be as unified as possible. The other concern was the Democratic Republicans, the opposition party, was much more friendly to France. And they worried that if the Federalist Party split, the Democratic Republicans would either join France in a war to destroy the nation, that's kind of worst case scenario, or just bend the knee and take very friendly terms to France, even if they were very humiliating or not in the nation's best interest.
We're talking about this very matter-of-factly, but I think when we talk about this period, we often forget just how fractious and vicious politics were. I mean, there is no love lost between Democratic Republicans and Federalists, and they have very different views on the direction that they want the new nation to take.
Horrible.
Yeah, it really was. Okay, we're now entering the period of the crisis of 1798. We've talked about how war with France was a real possibility that the United States was preparing for, even as John Adams still hoped for a peaceful resolution. We've also touched on the fact that there were the war hawks among the arch-Federalists, men like Timothy Pickering, who perceived the Democratic-Republican Party as pandering to French interests and willing to kind of surrender the United States if they got their way. It was also during this period of intense politics and possibility of war with France that Congress passed the now infamous Alien and Sedition Acts. Lindsay, Diana would like to know more about these acts, how they fit into the crisis of 1798, and how John Adams justified signing these acts into law.
Yeah, it's such a great question, and it's proving to be a more relevant topic than I anticipated. The Alien and Sedition Acts are actually a series of 4 bills. They were passed in the summer of 1798 in this sort of war fever moment. I think the context is really important because in some cases there were justifiable fears that were then used for political purposes, and some of the bills were outwardly political. The Naturalization Bill was actually the first one passed, and that made it harder to become a citizen. It increased the amount of time you had to be in the country from 5 to 14 years and added a bunch of hoops that you had to jump through. And this was largely because immigrants tended to vote for Democratic Republicans. So this was a completely political bill. Second, there were 2 Alien Acts. The first was called the Alien Enemies Act. It was a bipartisan measure that was actually first put forward by the Democratic Republicans, hoping to stave off a more extreme measure. And it was seen as a very good bill because it had 2 protections. One, it required a declaration of war by Congress in order for it to go into effect. That was a mechanism that had not yet taken place, and so it was sort of this check on executive power. Second, if the president did then order deportations of foreign nationals of the enemy nation, it still provided for due process for those individuals. So it was seen as a very understandable war measure and has actually been on the books since. Now, sometimes it has been used for very bad purposes. For example, it was used to justify Japanese internment, and the Supreme Court has actually repudiated that usage. But at the time, it was seen as reasonable. The second one, the Alien Friends Act, gave the president unlimited authority to deport foreign nationals at will without any due process. This was a very extreme measure. The Federalists basically jammed it through Congress. Critically, John Adams never used it. So that's a really important distinction. The last bill is the Sedition Bill. And the Sedition Bill made it a crime to criticize Congress or the president, notably leaving out the vice president, who was Thomas Jefferson. It also expired on the last day of Adams' first term if he was reelected. And it did provide for due process and for defense. But the problem was, how do you prove the veracity of a political opinion? It's really hard to do that. And most of the sedition was political opinions. Context here, I mentioned being really essential, in particular applies to this bill, because today we have a pretty good understanding of what the First Amendment applies to. For example, you're not allowed to say things like fire in a crowded theater. You can use speech to invoke violence, but that is not protected. Those types of limitations and understandings were not in place at the time. Those types of judicial opinions had not yet happened. And what that meant was editors could call for violence and regularly did. There was violence in the streets. I say all that not to in any way excuse the partisan nature of the enforcement, but rather to say that I think people genuinely were worried about how speech was being used to cause violence and could be used, especially in war, to undermine the nation, but then allowed that fear to be perverted into this bill. Adams did not ask for any of these bills. He did not whip votes for any of them. He did not ask for support for any of them, but he did sign them. And when some of the prosecutions happened, he occasionally was happy about it because they were particularly mean to him. So it is absolutely the dark mark on his presidency. We should hold it against him, but I think that Congress deserves a lot more blame than he does.
And I think some of his cabinet secretaries, like Timothy Pickering, should also take a lot of blame. One of the things that really struck me as I read Making the Presidency was that it wasn't John Adams, but Timothy Pickering, his Secretary of State, who kept going to the Attorney General and other lawyers throughout the United States to point out these printers who printed words and ideas that Pickering didn't like. For example, he told the Attorney General that he should prosecute Benjamin Franklin's grandson, Benjamin Franklin Bache, because his Philadelphia-based Aurora newspaper was not printing news favorable to the Federalist Party. And when we read your book, we get the impression that Pickering wasn't asking for these prosecutions because John Adams told him to ask for them, but that he was asking for them because he wanted them to happen.
That's right. A lot of people mistake the way that Congress and the executive branch works today and impose that on the same government at the time. Congress was way more powerful than it was, but also the Secretary of State had a lot of domestic responsibilities. And so Pickering was actually responsible for overseeing these prosecutions. And he really genuinely had a personality that was best suited for like the Spanish Inquisition. And so he loved this activity. He thought it was great. And so he absolutely deserves most of the blame for almost all bad things.
Now, in 1799, because John Adams hadn't given up hope for peace, Adams decided, against the wishes of his cabinet, to dispatch a second peace delegation to France. Lindsay, why did Adams's cabinet object to a second peace delegation? Did they really want war?
The cabinet objected because they felt like they didn't have reason to trust that France would actually engage in good faith negotiations. And on one hand, that's understandable because the previous peace delegation had been treated so poorly. But Adams had been quite meticulous in putting out his feelers. He had this incredible web of informants across the European continent, spearheaded by his son, John Quincy Adams, who was the minister to Berlin at the time. And what they were reporting back to him is that France had expected that it could really bully the United States, that it was much more divided internally and would be a pushover for anything that France had asked for. And when instead the United States responded with strength, with outrage, with these defensive measures, France had really done a 180. They actually didn't want war, and Adams was very much right about that assumption. So they started sending messages saying, we will treat whoever you send with respect. We will welcome them. We will negotiate with them. And at various times, they actually quoted the language that Adams had used in his presidential addresses, saying they will treat the minister with respect that is due to an independent and sovereign nation. So Adams got these letters and he said, look, I have proof that they will act accordingly. And some of members of the cabinet felt that that was still insufficient. But also, they really wanted war. They wanted the army to exist. And they knew that if diplomacy went well, a lot of the officers would return their commissions, a lot of the soldiers would leave. And that's exactly what happened.
It also seemed to be around this time, 1799, when John Adams is making headway with his second peace delegation, that he became fully aware that his cabinet secretaries were in fact writing and getting orders from Alexander Hamilton. Can you tell us the moment when Adams fully realized that his cabinet was meddling with his administration, that Alexander Hamilton was trying to direct his actions, and what he did to bring his cabinet secretaries under his authority and control?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the turning points for him was when he was getting ready to send this second peace delegation, and he went to meet with his cabinet, which had holed up in Trenton, New Jersey to escape the yellow fever outbreak in Philadelphia. And Alexander Hamilton just happened to be there. Now, it's possible that Hamilton was there to talk with James McHenry, who was the Secretary of War, about the army and to meet with other officials. But it also seemed highly suspicious, especially when Hamilton took it upon himself to come meet with the president and to deliver a lecture on foreign policy. Now, keep in mind, Alexander Hamilton had never held a position of foreign policy. He had never been a diplomat. He had never been Secretary of State. Adams basically thought, like, who is this nobody who is lecturing me on a subject that he knows nothing about? And he absolutely lost his mind. He let Hamilton have it. He told him he was nobody. And that conversation ended very poorly. And I think really convinced Adams that there was a much more nefarious activity afoot than he had originally expected. What's interesting is that conversation took place in October of 1799. They then went back to Philadelphia once the first frost had arrived and the threat of yellow fever had dissipated. And he kind of waited, and he waited until May of 1800, I think, because he was waiting to see how the electoral politics unfolded. And once he was selected as the Federalist candidate, then he basically said, fine, I can now make my choices. And he offered McHenry the opportunity to resign. And then he offered Pickering the opportunity to resign, which was the gentleman's way out. It was totally appropriate at that time to resign from office. There was nothing dishonorable about it. And so Adams made this offer, which was kind of big of him, given the very poor relationships they had had at that point. And Pickering said no. He said he wanted to stay in office until the end of the term, and no, thank you. And it was a very snarky letter. It's one of the snarkiest letters I have ever seen a secretary send to a president. Adams wrote back, no salutation, no thank you for your service, basically just you are relieved from office. And then for good measure, he changed the locks on the Secretary of State offices, which I really enjoyed that level of petty, if I'm being honest. What is important is what happened next. He then submitted the replacement, John Marshall, to the Senate for confirmation. And when the Senate confirmed Marshall, they were establishing a legal precedent that did not exist before. It was unclear how a secretary could be removed from office because it had never been done. When Washington was displeased with someone, they were so horrified that they would just resign immediately. And so he had never had to fire anybody. The Constitution doesn't say how it's to be done. The legislation creating the executive departments doesn't say, because Congress couldn't agree. So they basically punted on the issue. So in firing a secretary and getting the Senate to accept it, Adams was establishing a precedent that the Supreme Court actually confirmed in 1926, but critically established the character of the presidency. Because if we think about the implications of that decision, if a secretary can do whatever they want, then you don't have one executive. You basically have an executive by committee. But if a secretary can be removed by the president, then you have the type of president that Washington had embodied and envisioned.
Well, now that we moved on to the highlights reel of John Adams's presidency, we should also talk about the Treaty of Mortefontaine, because you declare in your book, Making the Presidency, that this is probably the biggest highlight of Adams's presidency. So could you tell us about this treaty, which many of us have never heard of, and why you think it's such a highlight?
Yeah, the Treaty of Mortefontaine is really underappreciated because it established the peaceful relations between the United States and France, which have lasted ever since. The United States and France have not been at war since 1800 because of this treaty. Well, maybe not because of this treaty, but it established a really nice foundation. That is not something we typically celebrate. We often celebrate the special relationship between the United States and Great Britain. The United States and Great Britain went to war 15 years later. So I think that as a foundation for an important alliance, it is critical. It did also preserve peace in an honorable way. It restored good trade relationships between the two nations. I think we don't remember it much because it was so divisive within the Federalist Party, but also because news of it did not arrive until after the election of 1800. And so it didn't have an electoral impact and therefore isn't as remembered as it could be. To be fair, also, the Treaty of Mortefontaine doesn't really roll off the tongue like the Treaty of Paris or the Treaty of Versailles.
No, it really doesn't, does it? Now, I'm glad you brought up the election of 1800, because where many historians summarize the election is the Revolution of 1800 and state that there was a tie that occurred between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, which caused the election to be decided by the House of Representatives and then led to the first peaceful transfer of power between the political parties. But Lindsay, you go beyond this summary to cover the actual politicking that went on in the House of Representatives to decide this election between Jefferson and Burr. So would you give us an overview of what happened inside the House of Representatives as they made this choice between Jefferson and Burr?
Yeah, this election is so fascinating. And I think it's largely been condensed into this phrase, the Revolution of 1800, and swept under the rug because that served Jefferson's purposes. But it actually was a much more complex undertaking. So as you said, Jefferson and Burr tied at 73 electoral votes apiece. That meant that the election was going to go to the House, where each state received one vote, not each representative, each state. And those were the terms of the Constitution. Those are still the terms. If we were to have a tie today, that would still be how it was decided. What that meant, however, was that Congress was deadlocked because Jefferson had the support of 8 states, Burr had the support of 6 states, and there were 2 states that could not cast a vote because their members were split evenly. Basically, everyone knew this by December 3rd, 1800, but the votes were not starting to be tallied on this new process until February 11th. In that time, the Federalist Party tried to think of all the different ways that they could thwart the election. So the easiest would be to get some of the Jefferson states to come over for Burr, make Burr the president who they preferred because they felt like he would be more malleable and he would be indebted to them, and so he would be willing to work with them. If that didn't work, they were trying to delay the outcome of the election until after March 4th, which was the day of the inauguration at the time. That would allow them to either appoint a temporary president or call a new election in which they thought maybe they could have a different outcome. In response, the Democratic Republicans started thinking about how they combat these plans. And they did things like station the Virginia and Pennsylvania militias on the border of the state ready to march into the city if someone else took the presidency. They tried to think about how they could constitutionally push back on these options. And citizens also took it upon themselves to make sure their voices were heard. Thousands of citizens gathered outside the U.S. Capitol in the wintry conditions and threatened to kill anyone who tried to seize the presidency that wasn't Jefferson. The threat of violence was so real that Albert Gallatin wrote 50 years later that he really genuinely thought that it was all going to end. So Congress convenes its session on February 11th with this context. They start casting votes. They cast 24 votes in the first 24 hours with no resolution. That continues over the next several days. In this time, John Adams invites Thomas Jefferson over to the White House, and he assures him that he believes he's the rightful winner. He said he would have no part in any of the Federalist schemes. He would not run for office again. He would not call up the militia or call up the army to try and suppress a vote. And he practiced restraint, which is a remarkable thing to do in a constitutional crisis. Ultimately, a compromise was reached between 2 moderate members, a moderate member from Maryland, Samuel Smith, who was a Democratic Republican, and James Bayard of Delaware, who was a moderate Federalist. Interestingly, they were both quite young. They were in their late 30s and early 40s, which I think is a good reminder that we can have people who make a big difference while they were still young. The way that they made that compromise was Bayard suggested that if Jefferson was willing to keep the Navy, to avoid war with France and Great Britain, to keep the national bank, and to maintain the national credit, that they would then swing the election. Smith brought these terms to Jefferson, and I think what basically happened is Jefferson sort of did like a wink, wink, nod, nod situation where he gave his approval without actually saying yes, so he could maintain plausible deniability. But that night he wrote to his son-in-law and said, tomorrow there will be a resolution. So he absolutely knew what was happening. Indeed, the next day they went. Bayard cast a blank ballot for Delaware, which took a state out of Burr's column. The South Carolina Federalist cast a blank ballot, which took another state out of Burr's column. And then the Federalists from Maryland and Vermont, which had been the 2 states that were split, left the room so that their Democratic Republican colleagues could cast their votes for Jefferson. So the final vote was 10 states for Jefferson, 4 states for Burr. This, of course, made Jefferson the 3rd president of the United States, and he had 2.5 weeks to write his inaugural address, to staff his White House, and to create his cabinet, which is a remarkable feat. And in this transition period, Adams was amazing because he insisted that his cabinet cooperate to help Jefferson, to basically give him briefings on what was happening. He told Jefferson about what was in the stables and what was in the White House so that he would know what was available to him. And he set the tone for what we want a transition to be long before it's required by statute or mandate.
This was another part of your book that really struck me because we do read about how John Adams helped Thomas Jefferson with information and whatever else he needed to help make the transition of Jefferson into the presidency run smoothly. And it struck me because this is a constitutional crisis, and it seemed that if John Adams had really wanted to remain president, he could have set that precedent because the Federalists were already talking about how they can maneuver things to keep John Adams in office. And yet, as you said, Lindsay, John Adams showed great restraint And he said, I'm not getting involved with the House of Representatives. They are going to decide between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. And I think Thomas Jefferson is the rightful winner. That's what the people intended.
That's definitely right. I mean, if he had wanted to cause a lot of trouble, he could have. And a lot of people focus on the fact that he didn't attend the inauguration. But what is worth noting is that he lost. He didn't try and overturn the results. And then he went home peacefully. And that is a revolutionary thing to do at a time when it was not done, and he was the first to do it.
Now, before we move into the time warp, Lindsay, in Making the Presidency, you point out that many historians have looked at John Adams's presidency as the low moment in John Adams's otherwise very distinguished career of public service to the United States. And these historians have said Adams was vain, he was opinionated, he was too direct in his speech, he was uncompromising, and he was just really difficult to work with. So this is the legacy that we're left with for John Adams as the second president of the United States. But you vehemently disagree. In your book, Making the Presidency, you go as far as to state that you believe John Adams remains one of the most qualified presidents that the United States has ever had. So would you tell us why you think past historians are wrong about their assessment of John Adams, and why you think he was and still is one of the most qualified presidents the United States has ever had?
I think there are two different pieces to this. The first is their description of him as vain and difficult. These are basically direct quotes from things that Hamilton and Jefferson were writing about Adams in 1800 while they were competing against him for an election. And we all know what election rhetoric sounds like. We all know what political campaigns sound like and political ads. And they're often not always the most accurate assessment of one's opponent. And yet, although historians often take Hamilton and Jefferson with a grain of salt, when it comes to Adams, they haven't. And they tend to take their word verbatim. And I think that's a mistake because oftentimes those descriptions are highly politically motivated. That's not to say there isn't a grain of truth of them. Sometimes he could be vain. Sometimes he could be difficult. But Jefferson lies and Hamilton is totally erratic. So I think we have to balance these things. The second piece is that we write history based on the questions we ask, because that informs what information we use, how we find it, how we analyze it, what we see in the text. And that's not to say that we're revisionist, but just that everyone has a different perspective on what they are seeing in front of them. And all of the other works on John Adams, of which there are many fantastic ones, were written before January 6th, which meant that they hadn't seen a contested transition. And I think that they were probably taking the peaceful transfer of power, like I was until that point. And it was really seeing how fragile these things are that caused me to want to know more about where they started and how they were crafted for the first time and why they were so important. And in doing so, I started to see the very small ways that the things that Adams did behind the scenes to ensure the survival of the presidency and the republic that are easy to go overlooked because they're not big and splashy like winning a civil war.
Okay, we should move into the time warp. This is a segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. Lindsay, Travis would like to know what would have happened if Alexander Hamilton and the Essex Junto, which was that group of arch-federalists that Timothy Pickering was involved with, he'd like to know what would have happened if Hamilton and the Essex Junto had not undermined John Adams's re-election bid. So in your opinion, Lindsay, what might have happened if John Adams had been elected to a second term as president?
Oh boy, that's such an interesting question. So I do think the undermining was much more significant than just the pamphlet that Hamilton wrote in October of 1800, because the undermining started at the state level and in the state level elections. And many of the states still selected their presidential electors in the state legislatures. And so I do think it sort of had a trickle up effect. If Adams had won a second term, we saw a breakdown of the political party system and sort of the recreation of new parties. And I think we would have seen that, but in a very different way, because Adams was starting to spearhead a more moderate party that really pulled from the moderate wing of the Federalist Party, but some of the more conservative elements of the Democratic Republican Party. And so I think we would have seen him continue to push back against the excesses of his own party and try and find this center way. Whether or not he would have been as successful as Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans ended up being is hard to say, but I think that that spirit would have lingered on.
Well, since we last spoke with you, Lindsay, you're now the executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon. Do you even have time for another book? And if you do, what are you researching and writing about now?
I've started thinking about it. I have a large stack of books next to me to be working on my reading, which unfortunately I do not absorb them via osmosis. It's a good start that they're at least in my house, but I'm working on getting them into my brain. I had one idea for a book that I think I will absolutely do in the future, but I think it's a pretty complex book and it's not the right one to be writing at this moment, having started the new job. So instead, I am probably going to be writing a John Quincy Adams book. I have long loved John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Dog Adams is my dog. And I would really like to write a John Quincy book while he is still with me, to review my text and be in my author photo with me. So that is probably what I will be working on.
And is there anything happening at the George Washington Presidential Library that we should be aware of?
Gosh, there's so much. We're open 365 days a year. In 2025, we are really going to be focused on a military theme. It is the 250th anniversary of the birth of the American Army and Washington taking command as commander-in-chief. And so we will have tons of public programming for all ages, everything from a Revolutionary War encampment out on the green to adult programming that looks at the history of the Revolutionary War, but also the complicated subject of civil-military divide, both then and now.
What if we have more questions about John Adams, George Washington, or the presidency? Where's the best place for us to get in touch with you to pose those questions?
I am on all the social medias. I'm kind of trying to figure out what's going to survive. So I have eggs in lots of baskets at the moment, but you can also visit my Substack, which is called Imperfect Union. And I send out a monthly newsletter with a history essay, as well as links to podcasts like this one and any other articles that I write. And it's the best place to stay on top of everything in one spot.
Lindsay Chervinsky, thank you so much for joining us again and taking us through the presidency of John Adams.
Thank you so much for having me.
John Adams's presidency proved instrumental in further defining and solidifying the executive branch in its work, how cabinet secretaries should act and communicate, and how presidents should enter and leave office. John Adams also played a major role in preserving the Union. As we have the benefit of hindsight, we can see that securing peace with France was critical to the continuance of the new nation. The young United States was ill-prepared for war. The Continental Army and Navy formed during the American Revolution had disbanded, and there were very few soldiers, sailors, and warships to fight a transatlantic war. Further, the young United States was still trying to pay off its Revolutionary War debt, secure its economy, and solidify its government after the departure of President George Washington. As Lindsay stated, early Americans really didn't know if someone else could be president. Constitutionally, it was possible. But could someone else truly command the respect and power of George Washington? Would the nation survive a president who didn't have Washington's sense of command? Those are big questions, and early Americans asked themselves those questions. And I'll leave those questions for you to consider. But what we can say after our conversation with Lindsay is that John Adams may not have been George Washington. He was often a lot shorter and a little bit more rotund. But he did show Washington-like restraint in sticking to his plans for diplomacy and not meddling with a constitutional crisis. Yes, John Adams signed the Alien and Sedition Acts into law for his fellow Federalists, but he personally never used them against anyone. But like most humans, Adams is guilty of having a sense of schadenfreude. You know, that sense of feeling happy at someone else's misfortune? Adams felt that anytime a printer who had been mean to him in his pages somehow found his way to prosecution. Now, as Lindsay reminds us, we don't have to let John Adams off the hook for these acts. In fact, when you read Making the Presidency, you'll find that even John Adams regretted having signed these acts into law. What we should remember is that our historical memories are shaped, and the quote-unquote winners or victors of history often shape them. And Thomas Jefferson was a big winner in history. So to use Jefferson as an example, we remember Jefferson for the Declaration of Independence, for his diplomatic work in France, for his famous feud with Alexander Hamilton, and then as a great president who helped grow the United States physically with the Louisiana Purchase. We remember all of these details because Jefferson and his supporters wanted us to remember them. What we often forget is that Thomas Jefferson was insecure, a poor public speaker. He abandoned Richmond, Virginia's capital city, during the American Revolution, and he was horrible with money, even as he profited from the work of the more than 600 enslaved people that he owned throughout his lifetime. People are complicated. They have many dimensions, and we should remember this when we evaluate their lives, deeds, and legacies. We should also take moments to ask ourselves, How do we know what we know about a person, place, or event from the past? If we do, it may cause us to rethink what we know and to seek out other sources and viewpoints, which can reveal more details and dimensions about a person's life and actions. And these new and reframed details have the power to reshape or at least add to our understanding about past people and events, just as we found for the presidency of John Adams. You can find more information about Lindsay, her book, Making the Presidency, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today, all on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/403. Please help me grow the audience for Ben Franklin's World by telling your friends, family, and acquaintances about the podcast. Remember, friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. Production assistance for this podcast comes from Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, what other historical figures or actions do you think we should reevaluate on this show? Let me know. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.